Hello and welcome to our webcast. I'm Danielle Johns with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, Improve Equity in Government Programs and Services. We're pleased that you've joined us today. And before we begin, I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
We have a couple of great speakers with us today. We have Tammy, Maria, and Kayvon, who will be giving us a little on their background. So I'll hand it off to Tammy to introduce herself and get the presentation started.
Thank you so much, Danielle, and thank you all for joining today. My name is Tammy Lohr. I'm a senior manager with Moss Adams. I've been working with government for just about a decade at multiple levels, from cities, counties, states, school districts, special districts, transportation, a whole gamut of really government agencies. Usually we're working on things like operational reviews, organizational assessments, and performance audits. And we've been taking a lot of strides towards helping our government clients improve equity within their programs and services. And we're so excited to share some of those lessons learned with all of you today. And with that, I'll pass it over to Maria.
Thank you, Tammy, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Maria Stroth. I am a manager at Moss Adams, and I have been working with local governments and other government agencies for a number of years in my career and really focused much of that work around equity. And so I'm really excited to be here and to share some of the things that I've sort of learned along the way and pass on some of that knowledge. And I'll pass it over to Kayvon to introduce himself.
Thanks, Maria. Similar to my other colleagues here, I've been working in local government, universities, and public utilities for a little under a decade at this point. And within that work, mostly doing performance audits, but also kind of expansive, kind of broader assessments as well. And as part of those performance audits, equity was always a consideration in the organizations that I worked at. So it's great to be taking this more holistic look, and we're really excited to talk with you all today about what an equity assessment focused purely on that subject looks like. And with that, I'll pass it off. Moving on.
Great. All right, so really quickly, I'll just cover what we're going to go through today. So we're going to talk about why equity is important for governments in particular, review this idea of an equity assessment. Some of you may be very familiar with that concept. Some of you may be newer to that idea. We'll walk through how to scope an equity assessment and what to consider throughout that process. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some tips on what to do with the results of that assessment to make sure that it's a meaningful and impactful process for your organization, and hopefully have some time for questions. So to get started, we wanted to just start by talking a little bit about equity and what it means within the context of government. I presume that since you are all here, you're familiar with this concept of equity, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, we wanted to start out with a shared understanding of what equity in government services really means. There are a number of different definitions of equity that are out there. Your organization might even have its own definition of what equity within services means. But this one from the Government Finance Officers Association really stood out to me, and I wanted to share it with this. So according to the GFOA, equity means that people should be treated uniquely by public policy to compensate for different circumstances and consequent need for help from government. So essentially what we're highlighting here is not that government should dole out the exact same level of service to everyone, but rather that government agencies have a responsibility to recognize and try to address the existing disparities that exist within their communities. And that means taking things like socioeconomic status, race, age, gender, disability, and geography into consideration to help remove barriers that individuals may face in accessing or benefiting from public services. So here we're going to talk a little bit about some common government services and how equity impacts each of those services. As Kayvon and Maria and I have all mentioned, we're very passionate about local government, and so a lot of these examples really focus in on that local level. So we'll dive into each one of these functions, the past, the present, and the future of how different groups of people were or were not able to access these services that really impact quality of life. And our goal here is to try to get you to start thinking about your specific community and asking questions that might identify where we need to focus to help promote equity. The first example that we have here is parks and recreation. And this area brings up questions like, where are parks and green spaces located? What amenities even exist at those different parks across your local community? Where are recreation programs hosted? How do people get to and from those locations, and how are fees set? I'm sure most communities have recreation scholarships for kids who qualify, usually meaning that they're on free or reduced lunch. But even if that's the case, there's still a bigger question of who is participating in these programs and what other barriers like transportation or access to breakfast or lunch could be present that could limit the ability for community members to participate, which would help them build connection and support a healthy and fulfilling life. We also tend to talk a lot about kids when it comes to parks and recreation, but we want to apply that same lens to other groups of people within our community. So groups like people with disabilities, as well as senior citizens. So thinking about how and what are they able to access to help stay connected with others. Many of the people in those categories tend to live in isolated environments and maybe on a fixed income, and it is part of our goal in local government to be able to also support them. The next example that we have here relates to public safety, which is a very tangible example of how equity, history, and bias can impact both the delivery and the trust of government services. And there is a long history here of things like racial profiling, bias policing, disproportionate use of force, differences in response times, and a very different lived experience of interactions with public safety officers and communities. Public safety is a very important aspect of protecting the quality of life for everyone in your community, and an area where equity must be focused on to help break historical patterns and unconscious biases that everyone has. We could have an entire webcast about equity and public safety, but that is not what you all signed up for today. So I will move on to housing. And a lot of different government agencies have an impact on housing. At the local level, we're thinking about where can affordable housing be built, what amenities are nearby, what access to things like public transit, hospitals, schools, social services, parks are surrounding those different neighborhoods. Historically, housing is definitely an area where government has perpetuated inequities through practices like redlining and land use policies that can restrict where homes can be built. I know that a lot of our clients are starting to integrate those historical practices into their housing plans. And when it comes to housing, I also wanted to mention that at this year's GFOA conference, there was a very interesting session on how property tax valuations actually can have bias in them and result in inequitable payment of property taxes to support local government services. So essentially what this group found was that the lower value properties would be valued at a higher amount for their tax purposes, and higher value properties would be valued at a lower amount for their tax purposes. And so lower income or lower valued properties were actually paying a disproportionately higher amount of local government property taxes. If you want to know more about that and maybe even look up your own jurisdiction, it's called the Property Tax Project, and it's out of the University of Chicago. I know that when I was in that session, I looked up where I live and all of our clients, and I had some pretty interesting nuggets to take away from that. Next, I'll talk about transportation, utilities, and infrastructure all together, since the patterns here are very interrelated. There's often been a history of disinvestment in marginalized communities where local governments are allocating resources to improve streets, water pipes, stormwater, public transportation, and now even broadband services to more affluent areas of their jurisdiction. For many communities, that means that there are areas where significant investment is needed to help shore up these disparities. So here you can ask things like, what is our pavement condition index rating at different areas within our community? Where are there potholes? Where is electricity above ground versus below ground? Where are the street trees? Where are we trimming? We maybe not trimmed our street trees. And also thinking about the converse of that, which is where are landfills? Where are power plants? Where are the things that are needed for our community that are considered to be less desirable to be located around? All of these pieces of infrastructure help make sure that our community is physically connected and able to access those core services. The last area that we call out here is courts, which is of course related to public safety. We found that this was an important area to call out due to that connection with public safety and the history of disproportionately harsh sentencing for similar crimes for members of marginalized communities, because that really does have an impact on perpetuating inequities within communities, since it can impact jobs, it can impact housing, and it can impact access to different services. So these are just some examples of why government is so important in government services. The decisions that we're making every day end up impacting our ability to equitably serve everyone in our community. We hope that this gets you starting to think about questions like where your organization maybe have some opportunities to help improve equity in service delivery. So let's start talking about equity assessments, which is our main topic today. So here, when we're thinking about conducting an equity assessment, the goal is to understand how we are or are not applying an equity lens to decisions and how to better support members of our community. Equity assessments can take a lot of different shapes and forms, which Maria and Kayvon will cover later in this webcast. But in general, equity assessments are a tool to help you take stock in exactly where you're at, identify where improvements can be made, the impact of inequitable historical and current practices on your community, and most importantly, develop a plan to take action. Bringing us back to our definition of equity for today, it allows you to stop and really assess to what extent we have tailored our services to meet the diverse needs of our residents. Where do people encounter barriers, and how do we engage with our underserved communities in a meaningful way to help address inequities? All right. So we are at our very first polling question. We want to know from all of you how many equity assessments your organization has conducted. So either you don't know, maybe you've never done one, maybe you started, or maybe you've done a lot. Really, this is to help us be able to understand where this is at in their journey with doing an equity assessment. I know that we've had a lot more clients that have been taking steps in this space and are starting to go from doing little pieces. Maybe they're thinking about things like salary equity within their organization or focusing on diverse recruiting. And those are things that they consider to be within their control to be able to do. And we're seeing this shift into really thinking about that service delivery piece. So that shift can be very daunting. It takes cross-functional collaboration, it takes engagement of leaders, and it takes engagement of groups that maybe your community hasn't engaged with as much. So we're seeing a lot of interest in these equity assessments. Maria and Kayvon, is there anything you wanted to add to that? I know you're fresh off of an equity workshop with a client.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with you on that. Oh, sorry, Maria, were you about to? I agree with you on that. I think a lot of what I'm seeing is people are really doing this for the first time a lot of the time. I mean, that's when we're seeing them the most. Some people have pieces that they've incorporated in, maybe departments are doing some aspects of it, but really kind of a holistic look it's kind of a new emerging look. And I like that you're really bringing in the distinction between traditional kind of diversity measures that you were raising and then kind of the impact-oriented pieces as well, that I think the direction is going.
Okay, great. So it looks like about half of the audience is unsure, about a quarter has never done one, and some of you have some experience in this space. And so it's really good to see this spread. And we're so excited to be able to tell you about our experience and maybe try to connect with those of you who have done some of these to hear about your experience. Over to Maria.
Great. Thank you so much, Tammy. So I want to start with talking a little bit about scoping an equity assessment. So there are a lot of different scopes or objectives that you could have for an equity assessment. Generally, we see them fall into these two buckets. So a higher level, really enterprise-wide equity assessment that can really help you pinpoint future areas of focus. So when we're thinking about an assessment like this, we're really looking sort of organizationally, kind of organization-wide, where are you in your sort of equity journey? Do you have an equity framework that you've established in your organization? So is there a clear definition of equity? And are the folks across your organization aware of that definition? Do you have specific sort of community-focused goals around equity? Is it clear what you're trying to achieve in this space? What sort of strategies have you implemented? What sort of policies are in place at the organizational level to really build that framework that would enable departments and programs and services to really effectively start to move forward as they think about being more equitable and removing disparities that might exist in the organization? So this can be a really beneficial sort of scope and approach to take when you're doing a lot of things maybe around equity, which we see a lot of. So organizations are kind of thinking about equity in pockets of their government, or you have people in the organization who are really spearheading particular initiatives, but maybe we're less sure, like how do we really move forward with this? Where are we doing well, and where might we need to improve? Where do we kind of get started? So in that equity workshop we were in just yesterday with a city, that's sort of what the group was talking about there, is how do we get started? How do we push this forward? What is sort of some tangible steps that we can take? And that's what a high-level equity assessment can provide to you, is that sort of roadmap of where to go and maybe where to dive deeper. You could also do a more targeted assessment to identify inequities in an existing program or service. So Tammy mentioned a really interesting example in her vid a little bit earlier around affordable housing, where they had found in some communities that low-value properties faced higher property assessments relative to their market value in comparison to high-value properties. So let's say you go to that website, let's say you identify this is a challenge in your jurisdiction, this is happening in your jurisdiction. Maybe that's an area where you want to do a targeted assessment. You want to really dive into what are the policies, what are the practices, what are the systems that are causing that disparity in our organization, and how can we start to break some of that down, and what are some next steps that we can take to improve in that area. So that's an area where a more targeted assessment makes sense, because you sort of already know this is a problem and this is what we need to look at, and this is where we want to improve. I would say that equity and equity related concepts are and have been a really integral part of governments for a very long time. We're thinking about serving our residents in our communities and serving all of the residents in our communities. But DEI as a field is more of an emerging field in a lot of ways. So we are generally seeing governments start at this sort of higher level. Let's identify what are those priorities for the future. And then from there, we can think about where more targeted assessments might be helpful. So those are some things you can sort of think about when you're trying to decide, okay, I know I want to do more in this space. I want to assess where we are. How should I start? This could be a way to kind of think about that a little bit more. There are a lot of different models, frameworks, resources that can support you in conducting an equity assessment. So I'm just going to talk about a few different sort of tips and methods that you might consider, and a couple of resources as well. So the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, commonly known as GARE, is a really great resource. They have a lot of frameworks, best practices, models, sort of things that can get you started around what should we be thinking about if we want to do an equity assessment in our government, in our organization. So take a look at their website, look at those tools and resources to get you started. ICMA also has a guide around governing for equity. And this guide was developed by Dr. Benoit Jacobs, and it really thinks about equity from the lens of change management, which I'll talk about here in a couple of slides, but it's another tool that can really help you start thinking about where is your organization in this space and how might we start to move forward. So one method that I would sort of offer is a SWOT analysis. This is something that many people know about, so it's familiar to many people, so it's a really great way to get the conversation started. It's also really great because when you do a SWOT analysis, you really want to be collaborating with a lot of different people. You want to be bringing a lot of voices to the table, which is just a really valuable part of any equity assessment, regardless of the scope, is bringing those questions in, bringing those ideas in, those voices in, really hearing from different stakeholders across your organization and external to your organization about what's going on and what's working well. So in a SWOT analysis, we're thinking about internally, what are our strengths and our weaknesses? And externally, what are our opportunities and threats? So with strengths, for example, this is really thinking about where do you excel? So a lot of jurisdictions we're working with now have focused a lot on language access. That seems to be an entry point that a lot of cities and counties and other organizations are taking as they're thinking about expanding access to their resources. Do we have our resources available in a way that people with limited English proficiency can access those resources? So that might be a strength in your organization. Maybe you have a language access policy already at your organizational level that says all departments, all program services need to have a language access plan. That's something we'll commonly see in a policy at the city or county level. And so maybe that's a strength. And then when we're thinking about sort of weaknesses, this is really what are our pain points in this space? Oftentimes what we're seeing right now is maybe we either don't have a definition of equity, so we're all sort of talking about maybe different things. Maybe this means something slightly different to different people, or maybe we have a definition, but there isn't really broad awareness about what equity means in our community, specific to us, in the historical context that we're dealing with in our community. Maybe we don't have sort of clear goals. The vision isn't clear. Where are we headed? Where do we want to be? What are we trying to achieve here? And without those clear goals, maybe we can't measure if what we're doing is working. So those are some pain points that we commonly see in that category. And thinking about sort of the more externally focused areas with opportunities and threats, with opportunities, we're thinking about, what sort of external factors represent an area for growth for your organization. A really common opportunity for governments is working with local community organizations and community partners. So what sort of community organizations are out there? What sort of partners are out there? Can you work with them to expand your ability to reach individuals in your community and to serve them better? what sort of grants might exist from other jurisdictions that you can leverage to be able to better serve the community members in your area. And then threats, what sort of external factors create risks to your success? So you'd want to be thinking about maybe, for example, state laws or political environments that limit your ability to implement equitable policies or to revise policies that you know are inequitable. And so, what can you do with that threat that's sort of external to your organization? And what does that mean for your ability to provide equitable services? You can also think about equity and assessing equity through a lens of change management. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier that we went to a conference recently, Association of Local Government Auditors, known as ALGA. We went to their conference recently, and Dr. Benoit Jacobs talked about how he thinks about equity in the context of change management, because it really does represent in some ways a fundamental reorientation to the way that we do business. We have to really engage our leadership. We have to engage our community. We have to really start to change the way that we're doing business to make sure that our services are equitable. So at Moss Adams, when we think about change management, we're thinking about sort of that, starting with that current state, and then what is the future state? Where do we want to go? Where are we now, and where do we want to go through this 4-phase process? So really thinking about initiating equity in this case. So developing that vision for equity, really getting sort of a common understanding around equity in your organization and the need and the desire to move us toward a more equitable state in our community. And this is where a lot of organizations that we work with are. They're sort of in this phase of this process. And that's great. We have good things going on. We know we want to be more equitable. We know that we have a vision for the future. And what do we do now? And that can sort of be a challenge for many organizations, is getting to that driving phase, which is really about, let's put the plan together. And so that's a space, if you're identifying that that's sort of where you are, maybe that's where you start. Because we hear this a lot, and we heard this yesterday in the workshop as well, is we just don't know where to start. It's so overwhelming. What do we do, right? And so taking from that initiation phase to that driving phase of, let's start putting a plan on paper. Let's start getting that going, can be a really helpful way to think about where you are in your kind of equity journey. And then enabling in this context would be really about implementing that plan. So we have that plan. Now we need to implement it. We need to start actually adopting the change, to activating the change, which is, let's measure it and make sure it's working. Because absolutely the last thing we want to do is implement something. Maybe it's actually causing more disparities or perpetuating inequities that exist, but we don't measure it, so we don't know that, right? We definitely want to make sure we're measuring it so that we can, make sure we're actually achieving the goals that we want to achieve. And when I think about change management, it's also, this sort of model is really similar to a maturity model, at least for me. And we see maturity models also a lot as another way you can think about assessing equity. So that's sort of thinking about, on a scale of maybe, let's say 1 to 4, for example, you're thinking about, okay, where are we on that scale? So 1 being those really beginning stages, to 4 being those more advanced stages. We're really leading people here. We're the leaders in this space. We are kind of showing others how to do this. Maybe that's kind of the advanced stage 4. So maybe thinking about kind of where are you from kind of early phases to more advanced stages can be another way to sort of think about an equity assessment. And what I'll say is, pros and cons to all different kinds of models. Maybe you think about a combination of these different models together. That's what we do at Moss Adams. But what all of these models have in common is they're really considering, what is that current state and what is that future state? So where are you and where do you want to be? Okay, I have a polling question here, and it is, in what areas are you most interested in assessing equity? So public safety, transportation, health and human services, community services, or infrastructure, or other? I think Tammy did a really great job of kind of talking about how we might see and think about equity in these different spaces. I'm sort of curious, Tammy and Kayvon, are there other sort of spaces, or maybe in these spaces, where you've seen kind of some really interesting equity work or equity questions coming up lately?
Sure. I think that one area that we haven't talked about too much in this session, but it could be an entirely different session, is thinking about equity within education, since that is also a very complex way to think about things, because you have different school sites. Within each school site, you have students with different abilities. And so there's just a lot of layers that go into how do we promote equity for that community and for that population of students to help support every student to be successful, which then has significant impact on their ability to then, pursue higher education or technical degrees, or just become really a strong member of that community. And we know the impact of schools so well. And I think that that's just one area where, again, it could be an entirely different way to think about how equity shows up in education.
Yeah, it really can show up in sort of all the services that we do. And sometimes it's even, oh, wow, I didn't think about that when we're seeing that. Okay, let's see these results. So it looks like we have a nice kind of range here. Folks are really interested in health and human services and community services and infrastructure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? Coming out of this pandemic, what did we see? And we saw how in that pandemic there were a lot of different disparities and a lot of impacts on different populations. So that makes a lot of sense that that's where folks are interested. Okay, great. So I want to talk a little bit about stakeholder engagement before I pass it over to Kayvon. So when we're thinking about stakeholder engagement, obviously a really important part of an equity assessment, one of the most sort of effective ways to understand how equitable your services are is engaging meaningfully with the folks who are impacted by the decisions that you make, the policies that you have, and also engaging with a broad range of staff across your organization to get their input as well. So we have some tips and kind of best practices that we've discovered along the way. And I'll also say that ALGA, the organization I mentioned earlier, I serve on their DEI committee. And a lot of this kind of information and best practices come from some work and some resources they have as well. So I'd encourage you to go to their website for some more information in this area. So conducting a stakeholder analysis, really what that is about is identifying who are all of those populations of people who are impacted by a program or service that you're looking at. It's a really great way to identify those different subpopulations of people. So I did a project related to disaster preparedness a few years ago, and we used a stakeholder analysis to understand all of those different subpopulations. Of course, we want disaster preparedness materials to be available and support services to be available to everyone in our community. And so who are those populations where maybe they're not able to access those resources as easily? Is there a barrier to accessing those resources? And so we were able to use that stakeholder analysis to identify populations like older adults, people who are differently abled, people with limited English proficiency, and really start to target our work in those areas. And I'll show you kind of a tool you can use here on the next slide, but I'll talk about some other tips and things to think about as well first. So you want to consider direct and indirect involvement of stakeholders. So direct involvement is thinking about interviews, surveys, focus groups, things like that, versus indirect involvement where maybe we're observing something. Maybe we're going to a meeting and just observing it and we're not necessarily engaging in it, or maybe we're reviewing data or other files that might exist. So, using a combination of these different methods is really valuable. But, there are pros and cons to each. And what I would consider is whether there is existing groups, existing information that you could leverage. So, for example, if a survey has already been done around sort of public perceptions of public safety, and that's what you're looking at, can you leverage that information? Was it recent enough? Did it ask the questions that you need, so that you're not kind of asking the same people to complete the same survey on the same sort of topic again? And really what that gets to is when we're engaging with residents in our community, we want to make sure we're not overburdening communities and we're not sort of asking too much of them and, you know, capitalizing on the free labor or anything like that. We want to make sure we're doing whatever we can to engage with them in an appropriate way and to leverage the information that's already been given to us. Also, leveraging community partnerships can be really helpful. So this is a way that you can engage with others in your community who are doing this sort of work, who know a lot of the insights and perspectives that are out there, but also who have a lot of trust in the communities that you're likely trying to engage with. And so they might be able to help you better reach out to those individuals and get more effective information. They also may have done other assessment work or other surveys or things like that that you can leverage in your equity assessment. Thinking about how to promote equitable participation is another really key part of stakeholder engagement. So meeting participants where they live, for example, offering language interpretation service or transportation service to a particular engagement activity, considering work schedules of folks, considering ADA accessibility, and allowing for multiple ways to give input, like in person, online, that sort of thing. This is the tool I mentioned around stakeholder analysis, which can be really helpful. I won't go into too much detail here, just in the interest of time, but thinking about impact, thinking about use, who's using this service or program, thinking about access, who has access to the service or program, who needs to overcome a barrier to access the service or program, thinking about engagement and communication. What sort of input was gathered when we developed the service or program, and whose wasn't? Who informed this service or program and in what way? So these are some categories and questions that you can sort of think about as you're going through your stakeholder analysis. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Kayvon.
Thanks, Maria. Oh, I think we both clicked ahead. There we go. So the next piece that we wanted to cover is equity investments. So a key consideration for when you're assessing your equity efforts at your government as a whole is how is your government investing in the types of activities that are going to advance those efforts? You know, organizations express their values in what they say, but perhaps more importantly, by where they spend their time and their resources. So while committing to equity advancements is important, it's even more important to invest into the efforts that will advance equity in your government. That's why when conducting an equity assessment, one of the core questions we're asking is whether you're investing in equity efforts. Now, these investments can take a lot of different forms and will ultimately be based on your government's mission and vision, which we'll go into in a few slides as well. There's some common types of investments that governments make to advance their equity efforts, though. For example, if you're working to establish a more inclusive workplace, you'll likely want to design and invest in initiatives to improve staff understanding of relevant DEI issues or diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. Maybe this means implementing a training program focused on this topic and incorporating it into your onboarding processes. If you want to diversify your workforce, you'll want to rethink how you conduct your recruitment, application, and hiring processes to make sure that you're reaching folks you may not have reached in the past, and that you're eliminating individual bias-based and structural barriers to their success in the hiring process. If you have externally focused efforts, you'll want to invest in initiatives to improve how equitable your services are to the communities that you serve. Maybe this means translating key materials. We talked about language access plans earlier, or conducting more extensive community engagement, marketing, and outreach to make sure that people from all communities know about the services that are available to them in the first place. Another key aspect of equity assessment is an assessment of the organization's planning efforts most broadly. And we talked about this a little bit earlier as well. You don't want to just invest based on what feels like a good idea at the time. The efforts you design and ultimately invest in should be driven by your community's values and needs in a thoughtful way. In other words, these efforts should be based on a plan. So the first question you should be asking yourself is, what kind of plans do you already have in place? These plans are the tools that we use to guide our work and to hold ourselves accountable. So if efforts to improve equity aren't considered there, The first step is to incorporate these considerations into strategic planning documents. This can look different depending on your organization. Some governments have strategic plans that are exclusively focused on their efforts to advance equity and racial and social justice. And in a plan like this, governments will typically outline the community level changes that they want to make sure they're seeing, like improvements in educational attainment or health outcomes by racial and ethnic groups. They then connect those desired impacts to goals and objectives that they can use to advance within their sphere of control, and strategies through which they can forward those goals and objectives. Other governments, or even the same government, may incorporate goals focused on equity and social justice into their general strategic plan and enforce accountability for goals that way. And others still might have department or program level plans that address equity goals or considerations, ideally which are driven by broader organizational strategy. Now, regardless of the approach used, the important thing is that these plans create tangible goals and are used to enforce accountability over those goals. So we've come to our third question for the day, and that's just what kinds of equity-related plans does your government already have in place? Do you have a strategic plan that's focused exclusively on equity to really highlight that and make sure that it's being considered in its own unique way? Do you have a general strategic plan where you've really embedded those equity considerations? Maybe you have aspects of goals that have a specific angle on equity. Do you have department or division level plans with equity considerations incorporated? Maybe you have a procurement plan where you're trying to see how you're going to diversify your vendor pool, making sure that that's tapping into the diverse members of the community. Or are you not really at that point yet? Maybe you have equity considerations that you know are part of kind of your organizational vision, but it maybe hasn't been documented somewhere. And you might have multiple of these. It's not uncommon for somebody to have a general strategic plan and departmental plans that are incorporating these pieces. And while we let some questions come in, I'm just wondering, Tammy and Maria, how have you usually seen organizations do this? Do you feel like it's mostly been at that kind of specific plan level, general strategic plan, or departments each kind of doing their own approach?
Yeah, great question, Kayvon. I think what we're seeing now is that C answer there is a lot of organizations have those equity is really incorporated into departments, the way departments are thinking about equity, and maybe in some departments, but not others. And that's really where a lot of organizations are, is how do we kind of get that widespread thinking around equity and make sure that all of our programs and services are incorporating and thinking about equity intentionally.
And looking at these plans, it seems like we have a pretty big spread, which is actually, it's helpful to see. So there are a fair number of folks who have that strategic plan focused exclusively on equity. Looks like most people really have a general strategic plan, and they have those equity and considerations incorporated. And this is an area where you can do it a lot of different ways, but the key thing is really having that accountability and all pulling in the same direction. Because like Maria was alluding to, you can have a lot of great work happening in each of those groups, but it can be hard to really communicate out and understand what's actually happening without that central approach. But it's not bad to be having those efforts happening. In fact, those can be, really helpful and really be advancing a lot of positive change. So let's kind of get into how those plans should inform an assessment of equity. So if you're conducting an assessment of your equity efforts, the kinds of strategic plans we've discussed should inform the foundation of your assessment. The plans we put in demonstrate our organization's values and will inform your evaluation. As you can see from this graphic, the mission, goals, and objectives of these plans will inform what's measured and ultimately implemented by departments. These plans tell us both what our priorities are, as well as how we plan to execute on them, which means that the elements in it are fair game to assess yourself against. If your government has committed to improving access to services to all members of the diverse community, for example, it's likely you'll want to include evaluations of your community outreach and language access efforts to make sure that you're following through on those values you've committed to. Because of how foundational these plans are, a lack of any type of plan that clearly incorporates equity considerations may be a signal that there are improvements to be made relative to equity and social justice in your government. Even if there are groups doing great work, that work might be uncoordinated, and there's unlikely to be organized in a way that you're holding yourself accountable for those efforts in a way you can really communicate effectively. So next, the state of your metrics is really integral to understand when conducting an assessment of your equity efforts. If you have those components done really well, you can directly assess the effectiveness of those efforts in advancing your equity goals. If these are missing, though, this represents a major challenge to enforcing accountability for your equity efforts. Because of this, we want to spend a little time outlining the kinds of things you should consider when establishing these metrics and gathering the relevant data. So let's say you have a great plan, which outlines the government's goals for equity and social justice. The next question you'll want to ask is, what equity-related metrics do you have in place that can be used to evaluate whether you're meeting these goals and objectives? If you want to improve access to your services, you may want to keep track of the percentage of community members by demographics of people who are using specific services. The second question you should ask is whether those metrics are documented in a way that can be objectively reported on. If your metric is just improvement in access to services, it's going to be hard to gauge what success really looks like. If you keep track, though, of the percentage of contracts with women and Black, Indigenous, and people of color or BIPOC-owned businesses, though, you can objectively speak to how you're doing in that area. We listed a few examples of what these kinds of metrics you could use to measure success for equity efforts might look like, such as the percentage change in BIPOC employees in leadership positions, or percentage of specific services that are delivered on time, disaggregated by neighborhood. But the exact metrics you use will really be based on your particular goals. If you have clear metrics, the next question is whether these metrics are tracked and used to inform your decision-making. This part is particularly challenging and a place where many of these efforts break down. There may be individual units tracking information, but if there isn't a centralized process for tracking and reporting on this information so that leadership can clearly understand how these efforts are going and use those results to inform future changes and strategies, this can represent an issue. The difference between information and noise is whether the data that's tracked is usable and informative. So if key decision makers don't have access to the information on how your government's efforts are going, the data gathering will be of limited usefulness. These metrics are also how you communicate to the community how you're doing. And if it's unclear, people may be concerned that you really aren't meeting their needs. So the type of data that you need to inform current status of these equity-related metrics and where you get that information will depend on the type of metrics you're looking at. There's not a one-size-fits-all answer for these, but there are important questions to ask yourself when figuring out what data you need to gather and what data you already have access to. For example, if you're trying to figure out what data you need in order to know whether you're meeting your goals, you should first ask if there are even clear goals in the first place. If there are, the relevant data may already be collected internally. So you'll want to investigate what data your government tracks relative to that goal. This will allow you to either identify the existing data you'll use, and if it's not already being tracked, it'll help you to develop a path to start collecting that going forward for subsequent evaluation. For many equity-related metrics, you'll likely want demographic-level data to see if there are disparate positive or negative impacts affected by your efforts by different demographic groups. The exact data you need will be based on what you're assessing and what subpopulations are most likely to experience disparate impacts. Based on these subpopulations, you'll want to investigate whether you have the data you need at the level of granularity needed to see what those impacts are on those different subpopulations. And while much of the data you'll be using will be connected to specific efforts done by your government, it's best practice to also try to measure the community impacts you're trying to push the needle on. These are those broad outcomes that Tammy and Maria were alluding to a little earlier, things like educational attainment or broad health outcomes. But the data that you'll need will be based on those disparate impacts in your community. Oftentimes, this data will be available through other sources that we'll get into later, but you'll want to investigate your own sources when establishing metrics for these impacts. Depending on the nature of the metric you're looking at, the data may already be available, and it might be gathered by an external source, may be tracked internally already, or it may be something you have to start tracking. But by identifying this early on, you can ensure that you have the data you need when it comes to time to actually measure progress. So a key question that goes into this and into the assessment overall is, what are the subpopulations that are relevant to your assessment? Because this will directly inform your metrics and data. And this is highly connected to what Maria was talking about a little bit earlier in terms of that stakeholder engagement, really making sure that you're figuring out where you're going to be looking at a really specific level. Now, at a broad level, those kind of 4 categories of folks you might be looking at. You might be looking at general residents, which is going to be those strategic level programs. So you might be thinking with general resident related data about broader outcome-based rather than output-based measures. So this is going to, once again, be more likely to be relevant for those broader community indicators. For example, if a government has programs designed to improve high school graduation rates in their community writ large, in addition to, for participants of a specific program, at the resident level data level, you might want to be looking at that overall high school graduation rate. Employees are another group that oftentimes folks are going to be looking at. This is going to be relevant oftentimes for diversity and inclusion efforts, employee wellness programs, ways that you're trying to promote inclusion internally. For example, you may want to assess the effectiveness of efforts to recruit and retain BIPOC employees or Black, Indigenous, people of color employees, and you may have all the information you need to answer that internally already. Service recipients might be another subpopulation you're looking at. So these might be programs that are designed to serve the public, whether or not the primary focus of these programs is equity related. So this can range from people using your public health clinics to people who use your buses. It can even include people who may not prefer to be engaging with your government, such as people engaging with the criminal justice system. And for example, you might want to assess whether bus pickup times are consistently on time across all your neighborhood, regardless of the race or income factors related with those neighborhoods. Or you may want to ask whether you're providing bus services where they're most needed. So if folks from certain populations are more likely to be really using those services and heavily reliant on them, are you orienting your work in that area? And then the last is program participants. And so whether or not a program is focused on service provision, it still might involve the public, and you might still care about those outcomes. For example, public procurement is primarily focused on acquiring the best products for the least money. But you might also have goals to contract with businesses owned by women and people of color. So even though that's not the service outcome that's the primary piece of that work, it is still relevant to the work that you're trying to do. The data that you get for each of these subpopulations is going to vary, and I've included some examples of where you might pull from some of these. So for that resident level data, things like the census, community surveys, population level studies, GIS data might all be available to you to answer those broad questions about community indicators. A lot of that's going to be externally available already, but you might be gathering some internally or analyzing it in a way that's really catered to your needs. For employee data, oftentimes you'll be looking at employee demographic data, payroll and compensation data, employee service results, grievance and complaints even, and exit interviews. If you're looking at inclusion and whether your retention efforts are working effectively, you're going to want to be asking, who's staying? Are they advancing? If they're leaving, why are they leaving? Most of this information is going to be available to you internally. For service recipients and service participants, you're going to be really oftentimes looking at program outcome data, program participant demographic data. You might be gathering a lot of this through focus groups, surveys, and this is usually going to be on your part to be doing the work to actually be advancing this and pulling in the data in the first place. So usually this is going to be internally oriented data. I wanted to go briefly over some common resources for data before handing this off to our next question. So obviously the American Community Survey, the census, is going to be a really helpful one for some of those higher level pieces of information, things like the racial characteristics, housing characteristics, education by area. Some that you might not be aware of are the National Equity Atlas. So this is really helpful for tracking indicators on some of those key community measures at the national, state, county, and sometimes even city level, broken down by race, including things like economic indicators such as unemployment, and others like educational attainment, life expectancy. And in some cases, you might want to reference this one directly because it looks at a higher level of granularity than you might see at the census. So instead of a broad category just being Asian, you might have broken down by folks who are Vietnamese, folks who are Chinese. Oftentimes there's different kind of challenges that might be unique to your specific jurisdiction and specific subpopulations that you really want to make sure you're understanding in detail. So this can be a great tool for that. I have that property tax fairness website here as well. This is the one that Tammy was alluding to, but looking at whether lower value properties are facing higher tax assessments and your equities and how you're doing your valuations. This is more specific, but I think is a really unique and interesting source of information. And then you have some other ones like the National Center for Education Statistics, especially if you're a school district and you're really concerned about educational outcomes. This is something that I think will be really helpful to be keeping in mind as well. And lastly, I just included some data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The last point being, though, that your organization might be the best source of data in a lot of instances, especially if you're looking at those specific output-based elements. These are going to be great for understanding those community indicators, but you're going to want to be tracking directly the work that you're doing internally. So our final question of the day is, do you have the data you need to assess your programs and your equity efforts? Is your answer yes? I have that data. It's packaged fully. We know exactly what we're asking. We know exactly how we're going to answer it. We have it ready to assess. Is it, yes, we think we have that data, either through a combination of those public-oriented pieces of information and internal use, but maybe we need to organize it and get it into a really usable form to assess how we're doing. Is it no, but the data is likely available from an outside source, so there's some work to do to really do that gathering, but you think that you probably will be able to get it? Or is it no, and we're really going to need to do that data gathering? We know we're starting up these programs and there's some specific answers we want to have questions answered about them, but we don't have that available already, so we need to be proactive about getting that information together. And Maria and Tammy, I'm wondering about your experiences with what you've seen. Where does it feel like people generally are on this journey in terms of having the information they need to actually answer the questions that they're asking?
Sure. So I don't think any of our clients are at A. If they are, then I want to hear about it. So if you were a client of Moss Adams and you're at A, let me know. I think that people are really in between B and C, where we have some information, we've started some work on this, we're using external sources, but like all organizations in the public sector, we have limitations in our systems and sometimes in the data that we're able to get from our systems. And sometimes it's just really hard to be able to tie all of that information together when you have disparate systems that you're using for different functions. So often I see that there's a lot of work that goes into organizing that information, and we have an entirely different webcast on data and KPIs that really focus on how to transition that triangle of we spend all of our time working on organizing the data and very little time using the data. We want to switch that. We want to spend very little time using our data and a lot of our time really thinking about how to use that data to inform our operations.
Yeah, that seems to reflect pretty well. It's a relatively small percentage of folks that think they have it and it's good to go. A lot of people maybe have it, and that I think speaks to the challenges of that area that you're alluding to, Tammy. Getting that information into a usable form is a big challenge, and it's not something to be taken lightly. And then a lot of you are kind of, maybe we don't have it, but we likely need to gather it, and that's an okay stage at this point too. Understanding if you're doing an assessment, part of that assessment might be identifying those gaps and saying where you need to go forward. And so the next time you come around, you really can say, how are we doing in terms of these programs? And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Tammy to close us out today.
Okay, great. So we just really quickly wanted to cover what to do with the results of your equity assessment. Maria and Kayvon have gone over some really clear strategies around developing performance measures, around developing plans. How do we figure out where we're going to start? How do we prioritize among all these different areas that could benefit from a targeted equity assessment or some rework in the way that we're making decisions or applying different policies? So this is just a framework to be able to help you all be able to understand what goes into that action plan. Again, we want those performance measures in there. We want to be monitoring those performance measures, looking at our results, understanding if we're not getting the results that we had hoped for, and then being able to evaluate them and then continuously improve in this cycle so that we're able to work on the equity integration really within our operations. So it shouldn't necessarily be distinct, but it should be integrated into everything that we're doing at that government level. And I'm going to pass it over to Danielle to close us out.
Thank you, Tammy, Maria, and Kayvon for a great presentation today. To our audience, if you have any further questions or comments, please reach out to us as we would be happy to continue the conversation. You can drop a note in the Q&A window or reach out to the presenters directly. Their contact information is in your console. If you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 2 weeks if you have any difficulty downloading it now. And finally, here's a link to the survey for today's presentation. Your feedback is appreciated so we can make the most out of your time with us. Thank you again for joining us. Take care, everyone.